Good afternoon, ladies, menfolk, and non-binary sentient life forms. I'm Charles, your instigator of literary productivity from Full Coverage Writers, coming to you today to talk about plot pacing. We are going to focus primarily on novel-length plots, because that is what I know best. I am not good with short stories or flash fiction. Granted, I have a short attention span, but still, short stories evade me at the moment. So, to get the ball rolling, we're going to start with talking about story arcs and just what those entail before delving into character arcs, which are slightly different, and then kind of going a little bit more into just all of the pace-based questions and scenarios and styles and tips and tricks to pull it all together. But first, story arcs. Most people have heard of Chuck Wendig at one point or another because he has a plethora of commentary on plot pacing and pretty much all styles and parts of the literary process in general. For the sake of this panel, I'm going to just pull out all of the family-friendly bits because he is very uncensored. Granted, we are usually uncensored, but let's keep it PG-13. Yeah, but some of his advice, just paraphrasing, is structure serves story. Story does not serve structure. It's important to keep that in mind because your story should not be based off of just some frame or architecture that you feel like this is what it should be. The structure should help your story become more multidimensional or help it build up, create depth, rather than the other way around. And he also says beats make scenes, scenes make sequences, sequences make acts, and acts guide the reader through the overall story. You can get very granular in a story and sometimes get a little caught up in the details of, well, I have this one phrase or this one sentence that works really well to explain things, and then the rest is fuzzy. I'll clean up the fuzzy bits, but just keep it continuously rolling so that the reader keeps going from sentence to paragraph to page to chapter. Keep them reading. And the more complicated the story, the more acts that story is likely to feature. The whole 3-act structure is not the golden rule. The 3-act structure is very frustrating, actually, and I will go into a little more detail as to other levels of structure, to insane levels, which made me angry when I found out they exist because they go into that much detail. And one of the bigger points he had to make was think of how a story comprises a number of smaller and larger arcs. An arc just being a component of your story that begins and ends. Characters, themes, events, settings, these can all have arcs. So it's not just the story arc. It's not just a character arc. You can have conceptual themes running throughout. They can just be part of like the beginning and then be wrapped up, or they can span entire series if you want. You can play with it however you like. It's just be aware of it all. And how many do you want to play with, and make sure you wrap them up or place them accordingly. Don't just toss something in because, oh, well, this is popular, or I want to see this in here, and then you just leave it. That doesn't really work. It always tends to fall flat, and then the readers get frustrated. That being said, what really is pacing? Because everyone has their own idea or opinion or perspective on what pacing is. It really boils down to pacing is the speed at which your readers perceive things to happen in your story. That speed is objective. Every reader is going to have their own perspective on it. Different paces suit different scenes. So you're going to have to be aware that readers are going to read different scenes in different ways. A fight scene is usually very quick, very fast, very urgent because a lot of action is happening very quickly, but most characters are not going to have every single detail of every muscle movement they make and all the reactions thereof. You're welcome to leave a lot of that to the imagination for each reader. do not go into Eye of Argon levels of detail and description. The Eye of Argon is a historical short story now. I forget the full story, but it was submitted to a literary magazine and it became infamous because it is so horrifyingly bad. They break pretty much every single writing rule there is in regards to description and fight scenes and adverbs and everything. It's a hilarious read, and there are challenges out there. How far can you read in this story before you break out laughing? I still want to do that with my crew. I think it would be hilarious. Supposedly there's a sequel too. Yeah. You can find it online. It's public domain at this point. Pretty easy to track down. Some of the important things to keep in mind for your pacing are pace just happens. It's pretty organic. I mean, you have to be aware of it and make sure that it works and flows in your story, but it tends to happen more or less by default as you progress your plot and your characters grow and evolve throughout the story. Now, that being said, the right pace takes work. A pace will happen, but is the right pace going to happen during the first or second or third draft? You're probably going to have to work and revise and tweak and evolve it over time until you're satisfied with it. That's where beta readers come in handy, so you can get an outside perspective of, is this working at the speed I want it to, or are there hang-ups or quirks somewhere along the way? And one thing that I've slowly come to realize, and I feel bad that I didn't realize it before, was stories are more than just one mountain peak. I mean, back in high school, they used to have like the whole, this is where you start. Here is your climax. Here is your resolution. One mountain peak. No. It's a mountain range because you're going to have a main plot, you're going to have subplots, you're going to have interweaving parts, you're going to have a whole range of stuff that goes up and down throughout. Some stuff gets resolved early on, some keeps on going, some may go on to a second book or be left open-ended for interpretation. It is not just a one mountain show. And as I mentioned before, the 3 acts style, it is the easiest to write, which is why it's the most prevalent. It's not always the most appropriate, because there are multiple styles for story arcs, and you can go from just 3-point to the largest one I saw was 31 points. Yeah. Because, okay, the 3-point setup is setup, confrontation, resolution. That is the foundation, or the blueprint, before you even get to the foundation, really. That's not enough to really work with. You gotta have more than that. You can build that up to a 5-point, which is more of your foundation after the blueprint, where you can do like, here's your introduction, you increase the tension a little bit, you have some conflict peaks throughout, and then of course you have conflicts, so there's got to be repercussions or consequences and how everything comes out, and then there's the resolutions, or how does everything end by the final page. That helps you get a better idea of, okay, just what am I going to be playing with in my story, what am I working with here. You can expand that more as you go into more depth. So you have like the intro, you have a problem or attack that really kicks things off, or an initial struggle. There's going to be complications, there can be failed attempts, there is going to be some sort of major crisis that happens throughout, and then of course climax and resolution. My preferred balance between all of these are some of the 8-points. The 2 most well-known are Nigel Watts's and Dan Harmon's. They're pretty much the same, just kind of different phrasing and wording, but it basically boils down to a character is in a zone of comfort, but they want something. And usually they enter into some sort of unfamiliar situation that they're not used to or don't really know how to handle. Eventually they learn to adapt to it or have help some way, shape, or form. Usually, if the author is nice, the character will get what they wanted. Usually, because the author is not nice, they pay a heavy price. Usually, eventually, during the resolution, they return to some form of their familiar situation or kind of an evolved version of their similar situation after whatever changes have occurred. And then after that, the final eighth part is just having changed, which helps create the character depth and make sure it's not just a Mary Sue or a Gary Stu, depending on your characters. Now, just for reference, the 31-point breakdown is actually basically for Russian literature. And I didn't get a chance to find some of the examples that have used this. It's just a Vladimir Prop's structure was based on 31 points. And for the sake of everyone's sanity and time, I'm not going to go through all 31 points, but I do have them listed here. And they are pretty granular and downright silly. Like, you can merge a lot of these. It could be 15 points, and that would be overkill. But then again, Russian literature. And all of these are findable online if you search for just story arcs. There are all sorts of styles, a lot of imagery out there to kind of give you a visual idea of it. My favorite's still kind of the 8-point arc. That's enough for me to build a base. I can work with that. Nuts to 31. No. Just no. That being said, you got the character arcs, which are always a little more complicated. There's usually more than 8 points throughout a character arc because characters are continuously evolving as they face new experiences and challenges, successes, and failures. One of the classic ones that some people swear by and some people swear at is Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey, which is more for classic style literature. That whole process it really boils down to like 4 quadrants throughout the hero's journey, and I think it was about 30 points throughout the 4 parts of just how the character progresses in such a predictable manner because it's so classical. It's so classic and used across most of Greek literature. Most of the epics that are out there use this style. I think the one that he uses a lot in his examples in his books is Gilgamesh, because that was like the perfect example for his scenario of the hero's journey. But I mean, you always start with, here is your base character. He is a level 1 character. The DM throws complications at him because the DM is evil. And then the character has to react and hopefully roll decent rolls to figure it out, get some companions to help out. Usually there's some wise mentor like Obi-Wan Kenobi or some father figure who knows more because they've experienced it all before or can kind of help guide the way. There's always going to be complications where you're going to have to face a lot of struggles and complications. It would be like the Iliad or the Odyssey. There's constant problems where they try to achieve their goals, and then in those cases, the gods say, F you, no, you're going to another island, and stuff like that. So I kind of skipped over the 4 parts, but like the original part where you're just starting off is the departure before things really kick off. And then there's the initiation part where you get the initial struggles and complications. Eventually, things start tipping and you go towards the return, where they've actually started getting home, or they start achieving their goals. They've actually accomplished something here or there. They've maybe rolled a critical hit if they're lucky. And hopefully they make it through all of the complications and the main climax and some subplot climaxes, hopefully by this point. And then you get towards the resolution part, which is the reign or the return, where there can still be some complications. In the classical styles, there's usually mistaken identity or fall from grace. Like, they finally get home, but it's been 20 years, so no one recognizes them, or they forget to put a stupid flag on their mast as they drive home, as they get home, and like everyone freaks out. Remember the damn flag. And then, oh, hey, look, it is me. I can prove it is me because reasons and because prophecy and deus ex machina and stuff like that. And then, hey, all is happy again, or as happy as some of those classics can be. The hero's journey is actually very fascinating to read and learn about and see all the examples that are out there. I prefer tweaking that style and either skipping some steps or evolving them or just turning them upside down because I'm twisted like that. And there is also like the 12 character archetypes. There's dozens of character archetypes out there, but there's like 12 main ones that most people focus on or are familiar with, like the innocent character who just wants to be happy. You got the orphan or the regular person who just wants to belong. There's always the hero who wants to improve the world. Sometimes they destroy the world in the process, but they're trying to improve it. There's like the caregiver who's just trying to help others, the explorer who wants to experience life, the rebel who's overturning what isn't working. That one's always fascinating because of the whole concept of overturn what isn't working. They're not just chaotic evil, they're more, I want to say, chaotic neutral or chaotic lawful, something like that, where they see something that really doesn't work and they do what they can to change that. And damn the consequences, because there's always consequences. You also got like the lover who just wants to be in a relationship with someone they care about, the creator who wants to just realize a vision or be acknowledged, the jester who's just enjoying life, the sage who tends to be like the Obi-Wan Kenobi who wants to understand the world or help others understand the world, the magician who makes dreams come true. I want to say that Gandalf kind of falls under that scenario because magician easy to associate with that, and he does kind of help make dreams come true with a lot of help along the way. And then the last one would be the ruler who is trying to create a community. Now, those achievements those goals that they want to achieve is kind of their individual character arcs. That's something that you can utilize throughout the entire storyline and throughout your plot to figure out, well, are they happy originally? How can we mess with that? Or are they unhappy now? Well, how can we help them find happiness or understand what happiness is for them? Something like that. So just even having like an archetype to work with can help you figure out, how do I want to pace this throughout my story? How do I want to stretch this out? How can I make it complicated for them? Because none of us are nice to our characters, ever. Maybe once in a while. Not always. Yeah. And we're now going to try and tie all of it together. I have all sorts of different little bits and pieces that were nuggets of information. So stuff like pace-based questions to keep in mind are, is this part of your plot being told or being shown? Because if you're just telling something, that can go really quickly because it's almost like a little micro info dump. It's easy for a reader to process it, but it's also very dangerous because info dumping is evil. Or are you showing something? Are you providing a lot of engaging details that the reader can just kind of absorb without even realizing that they're going through it and continuing through the storyline? Because told implies one person's perspective, and that skips parts or focuses only on certain aspects. Shown implies current action. It's more engaging, and there are usually finer details. Are certain activities or scenes during travel integral to the plot? There are a lot of authors out there who complain about fantasy books because almost every single one has a sea voyage, even if it's not necessary. And then, of course, if you have a sea voyage, one of your characters has to get sick on that ship, and it has to be a scene that's in your story. It's almost like an unwritten rule that for some reason everyone follows, but then a lot of authors get upset because everyone follows it. You don't need that. Unless it is integral to the plot somehow, then by all means. But most stories are, eventually you have to travel from point A to point B. Do you need the travel time in your story? Is there anything that happens during that travel time that helps progress the story, progress your characters, add depth? It can be a lighthearted scene that can be a bit of fluff, but if it helps flesh out your characters, then by all means. If you're just putting it in for word count, no. I mean, if it's the first draft or the crap draft, yeah, all bets are off. Do what you need to do to get the story down. But during revision process, pull it out if it's not necessary. And that can be hard because there are some really good scenes that we enjoy, but they just don't really work, or they're not really progressing the story or the characters. You can keep that in a little folder outside of your real book and save it for maybe another story or some behind the scenes stuff you can give to your readers and fans, because like this is a little vignette that didn't make it into the book, but hey, it's something we can work with and have fun with. And when does the story begin compared to when does the inciting incident occur? Those are two different things entirely. The beginning can be all the way over here, but the inciting incident that really kicks your characters into moving and acting can be all the way over here. Sometimes they're right next to each other, sometimes not. But be aware of it, think about it, like try to focus on the inciting incident more than the beginning, because if you don't, then you generally end up with a prologue, which is the beginning before you hit the inciting incident. And prologues are very tricky to pull off successfully because a lot of those are just intro dumping. It can be useful, but it's hard for readers to get through an intro dumping prologue and then start with the inciting incident. Not everyone reads a prologue anymore even. So if there's important information in there, then they're going to miss it or overlook it, or they're not going to get past the prologue and they're just going to say like, I don't want to read this. This is just pure info. Like, meh. So be aware of that, play around with it, figure out what works best for you. Oh yeah, and some do nots. The first one was intro dumping. There's a reason why so many people say, show, don't tell. Do not start a story off with just several pages of telling, unless you're doing a classical style like epic, in which case, have fun with that. Be careful starting en medias res, I can never pronounce that one properly, or like just in the middle of an action without enough setup or backstory early on for readers to play catch up. It can be convenient for us to just start in the middle of an action scene or in the middle of the plot because, okay, that's where we had our original idea, so let's just get the ball rolling. You need the initial setup to get the readers drawn in and engaged before you get to the real fun bits. Otherwise, it can be very disorienting, very confusing. It's tricky to just dive in headfirst into a story without really knowing what's going on or what you're going to be dealing with as a reader. Another one is do not have a prologue longer than chapter 1. This is where intro dumping is dangerous. The prologue should be the equivalent of like an executive summary or just a little preview blurb to kind of whet their appetites, get the ball rolling a little bit, but then dive right into chapter 1. Do not slow down the plot simply to extend word count action, unless it's a NaNoWriMo story. Then it's okay. NaNoWriMo is National Novel Writing Month, 50,000 words in 30 days, where word count is more important because it's just all about getting the story down onto the paper first. Revision comes later. But that being said, don't just put words down on the paper to extend the word count and your page count. It's okay to cut a lot of the fluff out. You don't need the fluff. The fluff can be nice here and there to slow things down or pace things out. If you have climactic scenes, you don't want them all bunched up against each other, but be sparing with it, be careful, be strategic with it. And the one that I have to be careful with is do not write like those gamers who play Skyrim as completionists or loot whores. Do not hold on to everything in existence. Do not detail everything in existence. Do not put that down on the page. Do not have 5 pages of what is in your character's backpack as they go on their epic journey. You can have that as your reference. So later on, if he needs to pull out his magical sword that was in his bag, good, you have that as a reference. You know where it is in that bag. The readers don't need that. Unless you're creating a reference book later on once you become a multi-million book seller, in which case, remember to put us in your book. But yeah, those are some easy do-nots to help kind of ease up your pacing or clean things up. Some easier methods for pacing your story are be aware of action. Show what happens in the story. Action scenes contain very few distractions, little descriptions, and limited transitions. It's very fast-paced. It's kind of like how, unfortunately, a lot of cinema is nowadays with fight scenes. There's a lot of cutting back and forth, which, granted, in movies is a little disorienting, so you can flesh it out a little more than that in your stories, so people can still keep track of what's happening, but you don't need every single movement. You don't need every single action, every single thought. You can keep it very fast-paced and just keep it rolling. Cliffhangers. When the outcome of a scene or chapter is left hanging, the pace naturally picks up because the reader wants to turn to the next page. If you end scenes or chapters with, like, all right, we're just about to get to something very fun and exciting, but you got to turn the page to the next chapter to find out. There have been more nights than I'm willing to admit where I just kept on going, one more chapter. Cliffhanger, one more chapter. Cliffhanger, one more chapter. Wait, it's 4 o'clock in the morning? One more chapter. Those are the fun stories to read because they keep the pace rolling, and the cliffhangers are a nice tease to keep the readers engaged. That's easier if you have shorter chapters. That is more of the style nowadays, it really transitioned pretty quickly in the 90s into the millennium, where chapters keep getting shorter because people have shorter attention spans and shorter time. We don't all have hours per day to just be reading. But if we can get a couple chapters in per day of a book, that's fantastic. So that's another way to kind of speed up pace, having shorter chapters, so fewer scenes in each one to keep things rolling. If you want more of a languid pace, then you can stretch it out a little bit, have a little more in each chapter, keep things rolling, as long as it makes sense. Don't have 3 chapters worth in one chapter because you want them to look longer. That doesn't work. As far as dialogue, there's all sorts of ways you can use that for pacing. You can do rapid-fire dialogue between several characters if they're like fighting or figuring out their next plan of attack or what they're going to do, just going back and forth like bullet fire speed. If you want things slowed down, you can do a little bit of dialogue and then some descriptions of how they react to that or what they're doing during that time. Like, my preferred style is like, okay, they've done what they're doing for the day. Now it's camp time or food time. Someone's making food and they're figuring things out. One's talking, the other one's making soup or something. It helps slow things down a little bit without being overkill. And it provides a little bit of scenery so you can read it and imagine like, okay, this character is a little grumpy because the other one was sleeping while he got beaten up and stuff like that. Another thing to keep in mind is suspense. This is a fun way to keep pace because just kind of like cliffhangers, building up suspense of what's going to happen next or providing a little bit of foreshadowing. Like, a good example is either a red herring, which is just evil but fun, or Chekhov's gun. If there's a gun on the wall in chapter 1, it has to be used before the climax or during the climax. You can play this both ways where it can be on the wall, but then it's a red herring and something else happens. The best style of doing that is you have it in chapter 1. It is used during the climax, but not in the way everyone expects. Do a twist on it. Make it a little unexpected. Like, I don't know, the gun backfires and then he smacks him in the head with it or something. And that helps build suspense because you fire the gun. Wait, it didn't fire. Smack him in the head. Stuff like that. If you need to speed things up, you can do a cut or scene jump, or also known as a jump cut. A scene cut moves the story to a new location and assumes the reader can follow without an explanation or the location change. It's good to wrap up whatever scene or character stuff is going on before you do the jump cut. Don't do it mid-sentence unless you're doing an old-style serial like Flash Gordon where, oh, that ship just got blown up. The end! Until next week. And then you realize, oh, he jumped out like 2 minutes beforehand. He's fine. I mean, you can do those type of jump cuts if you want to go old style or like sci-fi pulp, which is always entertaining, but not that prevalent anymore. It's kind of a shame that sci-fi pulp is slowed down a little bit. You can also do rapid fire cuts. There's several authors out there nowadays who have been doing this where you can have one chapter and there's 20 different scenes going on in this chapter because your characters are spread out doing different things at different times. But all right, you have this character doing this, but simultaneously this character is 2 states over doing this. And you can have a line break or like a little bar separating everything to keep things rolling. But it all ties in together throughout the chapter. I'm not a big fan of that style because I'm not good at that style. But for some, it works, so it's definitely worth at least trying. The biggest thing is make it digestible. Now, no, don't have people eating your stories. There's not enough protein in books or paper. And it's just messy. But make segments short. Make them easily readable so they can go from one scene to the next with minimal fuss. Keep the flow rolling. Short segments are easily digested and end quickly. Since they portray a complete action, the reader passes through them quickly as opposed to being bogged down by complex actions and descriptions. The Eye of Argon is a perfect example of that. It takes me forever to read the first page because there's so much dialogue and run-on sentences that it takes forever for me to comprehend what is going on. Still a fantastic read, though. Some other things to keep in mind for pacing action scenes in general. Don't overwrite. You should leave as much to the reader's imagination as you can, so try and keep it basic. But if there's certain styles the characters use, like if they're certain swordsmiths or gunsmiths or whatever, you can add a bit of flavor in there. It's just like the choreography of the scene may be exact in your head. You may be able to picture it perfectly. But don't try to force your readers to see the exact same thing that you see. Leave a little bit of interpretation and perspective to them, because it is near impossible to put what's in your head exactly down onto the paper in such a way that it is conveyed to every single reader, because everyone reads and perceives things a little bit differently. So it's important to keep that in mind. There are a few authors out there who don't keep that in mind, and it gets frustrating. They still get published, but it is frustrating. It's also important to remember that variation is key. Don't just have a lot of quick fire stuff or slow languid stuff. You got to break it up a little bit. You can have quick stuff interspersed with some slow stuff to give it context, to show why was the quick stuff so important versus everything slowing down a little bit now because they have some time to rest or recuperate or decompress. You need that variation to give context to your readers. If everything is fast-paced, that may not be conveyed to the readers because it's just all consistent. The same for being languid or slow. You got to have the variation. Otherwise, how are people going to have the context to know what's important and what's not? And tying into that, perspective is relative. Every reader interprets things a little differently. The best way of doing that is just try and do your best to convey what you want, have beta readers read it, and give feedback as to how did they read it, how did they perceive it. As long as it's in sync enough with what you want conveyed, you're good. If there are any deviations or little fuzzy bits, then you know where to focus your editing on. Another fun one is verbs, not adverbs. Action scenes demand brevity, and adverbs are the opposite. The occasional adverb does help every now and then. It can add a little bit of extra punch to a sentence, but use them sparingly. Use them strategically. Do not use them every single sentence, please. Unless it's NaNoWriMo and you need the word count. And another one would be detail is a dirty word. Why is it a dirty word? The key to getting an action scene right is learning that detail is the dirty word. Television and movies have taught us that the choreography of a climactic scene is important, but different mediums call for different tricks. There's a lot of fight scenes out there in movies where it cuts back and forth and back and forth. It's hard to see exactly everything that's going on. Sometimes it's because I just have bad vision. It's hard to see just what happened to each character unless they specifically slow it down. So like the Avengers, when Thor is fighting Loki on Stark's tower, they slow it down so you see him get stabbed. But there are other scenes throughout that fight in Manhattan where it's just back and forth. You're not quite sure who's shooting what, when, and where, and at whom until they slow it down and like, oh, that character fell down. That's not good. But it's Captain America. He survives. He's good. It's safe. And then once the Hulk shows up, everything's fine. Nothing can defeat that. But yeah, it's important to keep in mind the level of detail you want for the style of story that you want to convey, because, I mean, different genres have different level of details as well. If it's sci-fi versus fantasy versus literary fiction, even if it's short story versus novel, all of that. So one of the easiest ways of keeping track of this is read the style of books that you want to write in. It can be trial and error to find those if you're not too familiar with the style that you want to emulate or similar styles as to your own, but it's worth doing the research and just, as I tell everyone, even on our podcast, keep reading, read anything and everything you can, because the more styles you read, the more your own style can grow, and then you can better figure out what you want to work with and what you can just leave to the side for now. Going to slowly start wrapping things up by speeding things up, because we just have a couple bullet points left. We have 5 for each of how to crank up the pace and how to slow down the pace. If you want to crank up the pace, use shorter sentences and paragraphs. It reads quicker, mentally speeds things up for the reader. Use less description and more dialogue. Dialogue flows quickly, especially if it's just back and forth, even between a group of characters. It's very easily digestible for readers. It goes quickly and subconsciously helps speed up the pace. Use active verbs and fewer modifiers. So cut back on the adverbs in the description and use more active verbs to show that stuff is happening in current time. So less passive voice, less past tense. Keep things in the present. Focus more on the main plot line and less on the various subplots. So if you really need to speed things up, focus on the main storyline or the main character arc or concept arc that you're working with. Move that along. The subplots can wait until you need to slow things down. And if you really need to cut things or speed things up, cover the quiet periods of the plot with transitional sentences, or do a jump cut. Like, okay, the main stuff I needed to cover is done, let's just cut to tomorrow. Or do a transition to, okay, now they're resting, I can skip this part, and then it's morning. Conversely, if you need to slow it down, use longer sentences and longer paragraphs. You can add in more description. You can pull in more character reactions and emotions and thoughts of how they're dealing with whatever you're tossing at them. Include more narrative and less dialogue. So less he said, she said, and more like the character says this, and then a little bit of action and response and reaction and all that, and then some more dialogue and more reaction. You can add in more modifiers and cut down on the active verbs. You can start going in passive or future tense, depending on how you need to play things out. It doesn't have to be right currently at the moment. And you can start pulling in your subplots between all the main plot parts. You can start figuring out your character arcs in depth, figuring out, all right, they were at point C now, but they've experienced a few things, or hey, that other person was flirting with them, so now they need to react to that storyline and start progressing that way. You can also use flashbacks or dream sequences strategically. Don't just toss them in there needlessly. If they can serve a purpose or help flesh things out, by all means, but otherwise they do tend to be unnecessary fluff that just bogs things down and can frustrate a reader. And that is basically everything that I currently have to say about pacing your plots for a novel-length piece. That's what we do best. For all the people who missed it, I know there are so many here. It is being recorded. You can check it out on our YouTube channel. And we have plenty of time now for questions if anyone has any. Continuously rolling so that the reader keeps going from sentence to paragraph to page to chapter. Keep them reading. And the more complicated the story, the more acts that story is likely to feature. The whole 3-act structure is not the golden rule. The 3-act structure is very frustrating, actually, and I will go into a little more detail as to other levels of structure, to insane levels, which made me angry when I found out they exist because they go into that much detail. And one of the bigger points he had to make was think of how a story comprises a number of smaller and larger arcs. An arc just being a component of your story that begins and ends. Characters, themes, events, settings, these can all have arcs. So it's not just the story arc. It's not just a character arc. You can have conceptual themes running throughout. They can just be part of like the beginning and then be wrapped up, or they can span entire series if you want. You can play with it however you like. It's just be aware of it all. And how many do you want to play with, and make sure you wrap them up or place them accordingly. Don't just toss something in because horrifyingly bad. They break pretty much every single writing rule there is in regards to description and fight scenes and adverbs and everything. It's a hilarious read, and there are challenges out there. How far can you read in this story before you break out laughing? I still want to do that with my crew. I think it would be hilarious. Supposedly there's a sequel too. Yeah. You can find it online. It's public domain at this point. Pretty easy to track down. Some of the important things to keep in mind for your pacing are pace just happens. It's pretty organic. I mean, you have to be aware of it and make sure that it works and flows in your story, but it tends to happen more or less by default as you progress your plot and your characters grow and evolve throughout the story. Now, that being said, the right pace takes work. A pace will happen, but is the right pace going to happen during the first or second or third draft? You're probably going to have to work and revise and tweak and evolve it over time until you're satisfied with it. That's where beta readers come in handy, so you can get an outside perspective of, is this working at the speed I want? Parts of the literary process in general. For the sake of this panel, I'm going to just pull out all of the family-friendly bits because he is very uncensored. Granted, we are usually uncensored, but let's keep it PG-13. Yeah, but some of his advice, just paraphrasing, is structure serves story. Story does not serve structure. It's important to keep that in mind because your story should not be based off of just some frame or architecture that you feel like this is what it should be. The structure should help your story become more multidimensional or help it build up, create depth, rather than the other way around. And he also says beats make scenes, scenes make sequences, sequences make acts, and acts guide the reader through the overall story. You can get very granular in a story and sometimes get a little caught up in the details of, well, I have this one phrase or this one sentence that works really well to explain things, and then the rest is fuzzy. Well, clean up the fuzzy bits, but just keep it. Good afternoon, ladies, menfolk, and non-binary sentient life forms. I'm Charles, your instigator of literary productivity from Full Coverage Writers, coming to you today to talk about plot pacing. We are going to focus primarily on novel-length plots because that is what I know best. I am not good with short stories or flash fiction. Granted, I have a short attention span, but still, short stories evade me at the moment. So, to get the ball rolling, we're going to start with talking about story arcs and just what those entail before delving into character arcs, which are slightly different, and then kind of going a little bit more into just all of the pace-based questions and scenarios and styles and tips and tricks to pull it all together. But first, story arcs. Most people have heard of Chuck Wendig at one point or another because he has a plethora of commentary on plot pacing and pretty much all styles and, oh, well, this is popular, or I want to see this in here. And then you just leave it. That doesn't really work. It always tends to fall flat, and then the readers get frustrated. That being said, what really is pacing? Because everyone has their own idea or opinion or perspective on what pacing is. It really boils down to pacing is the speed at which your readers perceive things to happen in your story. That speed is objective. Every reader is going to have their own perspective on it. Different paces suit different scenes. So you're going to have to be aware that readers are going to read different scenes in different ways. A fight scene is usually very quick, very fast, very urgent because a lot of action is happening very quickly, but most characters are not going to have every single detail of every muscle movement they make and all the reactions thereof. You're welcome to leave a lot of that to the imagination for each reader. Do not go into Eye of Argon levels of detail and description. The Eye of Argon is a historical short story now. I forget the full story, but it was submitted to a literary magazine and it became infamous because it is so